Biodiversity is a critical topic that we hear a lot about when we're talking about environmental issues. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is defined in a number of different ways. You can think of biodiversity as the richness of different species that are present on Earth or in a given ecosystem. You could also think of biodiversity as the genetic diversity within a particular species. And so some species have more genetic diversity within them, which makes them more able to adapt when they're subjected to environmental changes. So an example of this would be the hemlock species. So the hemlock trees used to be present all across the northeastern United States about 5,000 years ago. And at that time, an insect moved in called the eastern hemlock looper, and this caused a huge decrease in the population of these hemlock trees. So the number of these trees remained low for about 1,000 years after the blight from the eastern hemlock looper. But then over time, the population did start to recover. And the theory behind that is that some of the hemlock trees were more um, genetically resistant to looper infestation than others. And so over time, through natural selection, those trees that were more resistant were favored. And so they became the dominant uh, subspecies within the hemlock species of tree. Also, you can look at ecosystem diversity, and that's how many different habitats or ecosystems are present on Earth, and are they diverse. Earth hasn't always looked the same as it looks today, and if we look back at kind of a very general history of Earth, we see it's generally accepted Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago, and then just 800 million years later, so 3.8 billion years ago, the first single-celled life form was formed on Earth. And there's still debate about how that occurred and what the source of this life form was. 3.5 million years ago, photosynthetic bacteria, I'm sorry, that should say billion, I'll fix that. 3.5 billion years ago, photosynthetic bacteria began forming, and that was important because then they were able to harness energy from the sun, and this led to the evolution of other creatures, other life forms that could do that, not roaming creatures, but plant forms. And at that time then, the ocean and the atmosphere began accumulating oxygen. So this was critically important because without oxygen in the atmosphere, most of the species that exist on Earth today would not exist. So these photosynthetic bacteria started pumping out oxygen, and then we see the development of other species. Then we leap way ahead, so basically bacteria evolving all of this time, other small life forms, protozoa, fungi, sponges, these all were forming, and then about 600 million years ago, we see multicellular ocean organisms developing, and more oxygen is present, and so that leads to evolution of life going from the oceans onto land. And once life form went to land, then we saw another explosion of new life forms, and 400 million years ago there were a number of land plants and animals. So this is a nice figure showing what we just talked about. So you can see the sun ignites, earth forms, that all happened, relatively speaking, close to one another. The moon forms. And then we start talking about development of life. So for a long time we just had very simple life, prokaryotes, cells without nuclei forming. Some oxygen was starting to be pumped out after photosynthesis, and these bacteria started to happen. And then all of a sudden we have a lot, as populations reach a critical mass, more oxygen. And we see the formation of lots of other stuff forming in the oceans. Then landforms started to come out of the oceans, and we see other landforms, so tetrapods, insects, reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, eventually mammals, started to grow up, and then eventually, in the very close history of Earth, we have humans in some form or another. And then if you really zero in, then you can see that humans as they exist today are a very small speck on the history of life on Earth. If we're just talking about the evolution of life on land, that started about 400 million years ago. And then dinosaurs became extinct only 65 million years ago. And then at that time, when dinosaurs became extinct, that's when mammals all of a sudden got their chance. They evolved, they got bigger, and then Homo sapiens came on the scene about 200,000 years ago, which are our closest ancestors. There are a few different ways that we can quantify biodiversity through the history of Earth. The old school method that we've used has been fossils. So the fossil record, if you dig down through layers of rock, you can use the fossils that you find in these rock layers to estimate the number of species that existed during certain times in the past. These tell us trends of like what came first, what came second, and general timelines of when they existed, but it's not a perfect record because some species have great skeletons or shells that are preserved, but others did not, and so we only can really get an idea of some of the species that existed. We estimate that since multicellular life has evolved and existed on Earth, marine biodiversity currently now is about 2 times the average of what we've had over the past 600 million years, and terrestrial biodiversity is also about twice the average. When we're talking about the average, of course, it started small in terms of biodiversity and then has evolved to have more and more critters as they spread across the landscape. So, like I said, there are some limitations to what we can do with the fossil record, but here's the general basis of what we can learn from it. So we are able to track species evolution over time as we go up through the rock record. We can see what species existed and how they changed over time. We can estimate the rate of the formation of new species, which is called speciation, and how that occurred as we traveled through the rock record. And then we can also determine how organisms responded to environmental changes, because some of that information is embedded in the rock record and in ice cores. So we can see how did the environment change over time, was there more or less oxygen, was the temperature lower or higher, and then how did organisms change as a response to those environmental changes. More currently, so we've been using the fossil record for a long time to gain information, but in more recent times, we've been able to use a process called molecular phylogenetics, and this tool is very interesting and helpful because it looks at similarity between DNA and RNA, and then also proteins in cells of organisms. So we extract that DNA, RNA, and proteins and look at how different organisms are similar and different based on their DNA and RNA. So from this, we can reconstruct how different organisms have evolved and what they evolved from based on how similar they are to different organisms. And so once we do that, we can basically go back in time and say, this evolved from this, which evolved from this, and it's very useful. So as a result of this new technique, we've learned that some things that we assumed were related because of their appearance are not as related as we thought. And an example of that would be fungi. If we look at just the appearance and the function of fungi and how they grow and where they live, we used to assume that fungi, so that's like mushrooms, but also unicellular or smaller multicellular fungi in the soil. We used to think fungi was more closely related to plants, but as we've looked into the DNA and RNA of this organism, we see that actually fungi are more closely related to animals than plants. So it used to be, and still in some schools, people are still looking at it this way because we haven't done a great job of relating this information, but it used to be that we would in school learn about the 6 kingdoms of life, and with the molecular phylogenetic information, we do classify life differently now. So instead of those 6 kingdoms, we now classify life into 3 different domains. These are the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and archaea, you don't hear as much about because these are all single-celled organisms. They're very small. It's harder to study them. Archaea in particular live in very unique environments, and so we just haven't learned as much about them as we have eukarya. Eukarya we've been studying for, hundreds of years, and so we've learned more about them. Eukarya include anything from a slime mold all the way up to animals and plants and um, some of these other ones you don't hear as much about, flagellates, small organisms that live in soil, all kinds of different things. But eukarya we think of as a broader domain, just because looking at these critters, some of them move around, some of them live in the soil as plants, but in terms of their DNA, they are much more different um, from bacteria than they are from each other.